With the news of the new Met Gala theme and all the red carpet looks we've seen from the awards season recently, we now know that a lot of male celebrities and their stylists cannot be trusted not to turn up in anything other than a black suit. And it makes me mad because there was a time where men used to wear some really colorful and out there stuff. So I'm going to take you guys into a journey. We're going to go back into the past where men's fashion used to be loud and colorful and amazing. So let's get into it. So unfortunately, we can't talk about that before we talk about how it actually became so lifeless and bland in the first place. So I'm going to introduce you guys to the Great Masculine Renunciation. So basically, the Great Masculine Renunciation is just a term created by psychoanalyst John Carl Flugel to describe the dramatic shift of men's clothing at the turn of the 19th century. When looking at aristocratic portraits from centuries ago, we can actually see that it wasn't unusual for men to dress in extravagant clothing, especially if they were upper class. So things like wigs, heels, and fur coats were not out of fashion. They were very much on trend for male rulers and those in his courts. So take Louis XIV for example. He's considered one of France's most fashionable kings ever. He basically revolutionized the whole French textile industry and established it as a fashion capital. At the court of Versailles, the king and his nobles were dressed to the nines, and Louis basically kept them in line with the power of clothing. Often the clothes he would make his nobles buy for different formal events would place them in debt, with a lot of them having to take out loans from Louis himself to keep up with the changing fashions. So then what changed? Why did people suddenly reject these extravagant and luxurious fashions? Well, I think that both the scientific revolution and the Age of Enlightenment definitely has something to do with it. At this time, there were many theories and discoveries, such as the scientific method and Newton's laws of gravity, that were being made that paved the way for modern science. The scientific revolution was also closely linked with the Age of Enlightenment, which was a philosophical movement that brought new schools of thought to Europe. It's not surprising that this lines up to when a lot of revolutions happened, as the Age of Enlightenment centered around ideas such as the pursuit of happiness, individual liberty, and the separation between church and state. With the upcoming revolutions, the extravagant and lavish dress of the ancient regime was considered distasteful and made nobles a target for revolutionaries. The Enlightenment also brought a new respect for work and had an emphasis on practicality rather than privilege. So it's no surprise that menswear became a lot less. It just became a lot less. No doubt that the upcoming Industrial Revolution played a part in this increasingly dark and drab wardrobe as well. With the emphasis on work and large-scale industries, wearing more practical clothing was probably considered increasingly masculine. They associated fashion with frivolity and mostly left it to women to keep wearing things like heels and jewelry. And as the years passed, men's fashion, for the most part, became darker and more simple. From the 60s on, menswear actually changed pretty drastically compared to the past decades, and that was thanks to a lot of different factors. But the 60s was definitely a turning point for men's fashion in what was to be later called the Peacock Revolution, and what I think is one of the most fun periods of men's fashion. So let's just jump right into the 60s. The 60s was a fun and interesting time for fashion in general. The swinging 60s, or the youthquake as Diana Vreeland called it, was a time where baby boomers were finally young adults and had the power to enact social and cultural change in a way that hadn't been done before. The scene is London, the decade is the 60s, and we've arrived at the start of one of the most stylish decades. London had transformed himself from a conservative city to one for the kids, and for the first time in a long time, Paris wasn't the fashion center of the world. The British invasion was truly on the rise and affected all parts of life, including men's fashion. Boutiques in London were an important factor when it came to fashion in the 60s. They targeted younger clientele with their experimental style and less expensive items. New styles were often made in smaller quantities, and they kept up with the fashion trends of their shoppers in a way that was unique at the time. They were a pipeline for young people to be able to get mod-style clothing they wouldn't be able to get otherwise, and a starting point for fast fashion. So a lot of people attribute the beginning of the Peacock Revolution with the arrival of the British band The Beatles. They really took the world by storm and had a lasting impact on how many fashion trends they influenced. In 1963, the Beatles wore collarless jackets designed by Pierre Cardin, which referenced the popular mod style, and it became one of their most influential looks. The mod style was extremely popular in the early to mid-60s, with the musicians being some of the most influential people wearing and influencing the masses to experiment more with their style. It started out in London and it was introduced in the 50s but really found its foothold in the 60s. The term mod is short for modernists, which described a group of young people that often hung out in coffee shops because they were open longer than bars, and they listened to modern jazz, ska, soul, and R&B. Though the fashion started off with them rocking Italian suits, it later changed to emphasize a more streamlined and youthful look that took inspiration from pop art. I think this quote from Twiggy embodies it perfectly. Anything modern was wonderful and anything old was terrible. Everything was up to date, up to the minute, brand new and streamlined and contemporary. That's what everything had to be. Houses, home decor, ornaments, clothes. Men's pants became tighter and more slim-fitting. The materials the pants were made of moved from wool to new synthetic fabrics that allowed more stretch and more patterns and colors to dominate men's fashion. So prints like plaid, checks, herringbone stripes, and multiple others were essential for the mod style. Just like pants, the shirts were also very form-fitting as well in this era. From form-fitting knits to button-downs, men's fashion was experiencing a wide variety of new styles. Mock necks and turtlenecks were pretty popular among adopters of this style too. Boots were very big in the mod culture, especially the Chelsea boot or the Cuban heel boot. This is when we see a revival in the heel for men's shoes, and I love it. Musicians were also a big part of how the mod look became more and more mainstream. British bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and the Who were big fashion icons at the time and all embodied the mod style. And Motown bands like the Temptations also wore mod-style clothing during their performances. As the decade went on, the prints and colors became brighter and more colorful, and the wearers of this trend grew a liking to pop art and psychedelics. Eventually, the style gave way to the hippie aesthetic, but had a series of revivals and continues to be referenced to this day. This is an important cornerstone in the Peacock Revolution because the mod subculture was one of the first times we see this great shift in menswear, which continues into the 70s. Men's silhouette got so much more tighter and form-fitting, which was a clear departure from past decades of clothing, and it's still around today. So the mod style pretty much ended with the rise of the hippie subculture. It was one of the many countercultural movements that arose in the late 60s. With the civil rights movement and second wave feminism happening around the same time, it's kind of no surprise that the youth movement was anti-establishment. The 1967 Human Be-In helped popularize hippie culture and pretty much kickstarted the Summer of Love. The late 60s and early 70s is definitely where we see a lot of change in men's fashion, especially if you were a part of the counterculture hippie movement. There were a lot of different looks in fashion at this particular moment, especially for men, that makes it so exciting. We'll start with the pattern and prints. So the early 60s were pretty mild compared to the later half. This is when color exploded and a lot more young men wore patterned clothing. The psychedelic art movement also helped these prints become popular and widespread, combined with the counterculture movement that loved anything that didn't conform to society's standards. The psychedelic art movement really took off and it showed on everything from band posters to clothing. But other patterns like florals and paisleys were really popular as well, thanks to inspiration from the Eastern countries. The hippie movement is also one that saw a lot of appropriation from Eastern, African, and Native American clothing. The narrow jacket, for example, was a popular style in the 60s and named and inspired by India's first prime minister. From native iconography, South Asian and Middle Eastern embroidery, African batik and dashikis, really nothing was off limits to these guys. I think this is definitely a point that's glossed over when talking about the 60s, but I wanted to mention it because Cultural appropriation in fashion goes back a long time. In an effort to reject consumerism and all the synthetic materials introduced in the earlier part of the decade, a lot of people actually shopped in secondhand stores. Men were wearing vintage suits from the 30s and 40s, which meant they became bigger again. This also meant military wear from military surplus stores, and workwear clothes started getting popular. In the later half of the 60s, a lot of rock bands helped popularize this military look. Some popular examples from this trend are Jimi Hendrix and Mick Jagger. You can even see it in the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover, where they wear bright and neon versions of military-inspired suits. All in all, men's fashion during this time was eclectic, and those who took part in this movement had a lot of different styles to take inspiration from. Elaborate outfits were definitely worn to make a statement or even elicit a reaction from people. It was also a very freeing time for men's fashion, as they wore bold statements and what was considered to be very effeminate clothing, and this would continue right into the 70s. In the 70s, men's fashion just kept getting bolder and brighter. There was definitely an emphasis on a tall, lean figure. So turtlenecks and slim-fitting shirts and pants were very important to the style, which was a continuation from the 60s. Milford Cottom, who's a fashion historian, wrote, "Wide belts and large buckles focused the eye on the center of the torso, making broader bodies appear slimmer. Over the top, a sleeveless waistcoat or jerkin, a classic single-breasted sports jacket in tweed, denim, or corduroy, or a blouson jacket in leather or synthetic fabric was usually worn." Fashion at this point of time was becoming increasingly unisex and gender neutral. Tight jeans, shirts, and sweaters were worn by both men and women, and matching ensembles for couples were advertised pretty often. So as the color palettes of men were just getting more vivid and varied, new patterns for shirts were becoming a thing. The sleeves, collars, and cuffs were inspired by older and romantic styles. Men's shirts sometimes had full and gathered sleeves, and even ruffled collars, fronts, and cuffs. This dandy-inspired look was popular with rock musicians, and they even started to wear materials that were softer and more associated with femininity, like velvet, silk, and chiffon. And to even further this style came the addition of glam rock and musicians such as Elton John and David Bowie, who embraced the style and took it even further. And while most men in the mainstream weren't necessarily wearing boas, brocade, and frilled blouses 24/7, the style did trickle down into the mainstream, making men's fashion more gender neutral. The 70s was the height of the Peacock Revolution, but it was also the beginning of the end for it as well. More conservative dress introduced in the mid-70s pretty much ended the Peacock Revolution. You have to remember the fashion of the 60s was pretty out there and turbulent because the times were as well. Like, there were assassinations, the civil rights movement, riots, and the youth rebellion. In the 70s, people just wanted to put those things in the past and just focus on the future. And with the US finally leaving Vietnam in 1972, the once big and exciting counterculture movement and young people pretty much died. In the mid-70s, there was more of an emphasis on power dressing, which was brought to popularity by John T. Malloy's book, Dress for Success. It encouraged men to dress more conservatively, and for a lot of people who were trying to find jobs amidst a recession and high unemployment, I can see why people would take his advice. Also, a lot of these kids had grown up by the time this was published, and with the death of many of these movements, it wasn't as easy to keep dressing up like that, like by yourself. With the introduction of designers like Giorgio Armani, men's fashion pretty much focused on conservativeness and tailoring that was a prelude to the giant power dressing phase of the 1980s. The Peacock Revolution only lived on in performers or as disco wear, which is a long story which deserves its own separate video. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of how men used to dress like that.